She's will forever be a legend here at Tottenham. It's a massive club. Everything I do is for the long term.
And still Ricky Villa. What a fantastic run. He scored.
Gascoigne going to have a crack. He is, you know. Oh, he's there.
Here's Lucas Moura. Oh, they've done it. The wait for silverware is over.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to a mid-January Tottenham Way podcast special. It's miserable. It is wet outside. It's a stereotypical midwinter's day in West London. That perhaps reflects the position that Tottenham Hotspur currently find themselves in. I'm Marcus Buckland, in the company of Tom Barclay of The Sun and Tom Allnutt of The Times. And lots of your comments are going to appear as we discuss a whole multitude of different issues. The transfer window, of course. What might happen to Thomas Frank? Is relegation really a possibility? And why are injuries coming back to the degree that's become very apparent over the past few days? It's a little bit depressing, as Saipo4349 says. It's pitiful. Craig Do 665 reflects. If you'd said to me 12 months ago that we would win a European trophy, Daniel Levy would be sacked, and yet the fracture levels and toxicity inside the club would have gone up to these levels, I'd say that you're completely mad. But that is Tottenham Hotspur. Let's start with the transfer window, because Spurs are poised to complete the deal that will bring Conor Gallagher from Atletico Madrid to North London. Aston Villa were interested, of course. He's a Chelsea boy through and through. His whole family are Chelsea fans. That's a little bit of a black mark against him. But if they don't want him, can you really blame him for going to the best team in London? Tom Allnutt, is this a good signing for Spurs?
Hi, Marcus. I always like it when you're wearing your, is that a blue jacket, Marcus? Blue half zip with a nice little blue trim. Is it a Spurs jacket? No, it looks like
no,
one.
but it's same sponsor, or at least Under Armour used to be the same sponsor, didn't they?
You could be one of those sort of, fashionable looking analysts that kind of sit behind us in the press box in the stadium.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Is Conor Gallagher a good signing? I think so. I think it depends a little bit on what kind of the question is, I think, because there are certain boxes that Gallagher clearly ticks, and there are certain boxes I think he doesn't tick. And it's in a social media post in 40 words or whatever it is, everyone wants to say this is a disgrace of a signing, or it's the best signing ever, it's the bargain in the window. I tend to think, if it's allowed to have, a slightly more nuanced view, that there's maybe a bit of, middle ground there. That ultimately, Gallagher is not going to solve Tottenham's main problem in midfield, which is he's not a connector. He's not a playmaker. His strengths are not in receiving the ball from the defence in tight areas, under pressure, and progressing the ball through the thirds. I think that's not his role. If Tottenham have signed him to be that player, then I think they will very quickly find out that he is lacking in those aspects. I think if you're thinking short term, they need a body in there, someone who's capable, Premier League ready, great age at 25, great personality, to go in and reinforce a department which Tottenham are clearly very lacking in at the moment due to injuries and due to Sarr being away at the Africa Cup of Nations. Then I think he's a really good signing. I think at a price that, to be honest, is, I wouldn't say a bargain, but I think it's pretty modest for given his age, given his profile. I think 35 million is a pretty good deal, to be honest. And we also know that this is not an emergency signing in the sense that it is an emergency, but we also know that Spurs have liked Gallagher for ages. They wanted to sign him last summer. They wanted to sign him 2 years ago, or at least Ange Postecoglou did, and the club were put off him for various reasons, his wages included, which I think is an interesting aspect here, by the way. So we know that they have liked him for a while. It's not a panic buy. It is an emergency signing, if you like, but they have also liked his attributes for a long time. And I think that Gallagher, even as a player, we can talk about his ability as a person, as a leader, his experience, and I like all those things. And we know that Mauricio Pochettino particularly likes all those things. And maybe the conspiracy theorists among us will think that there may be a link there coming up in the summer. But I think even as a player, even as a footballer, I think Gallagher can bring things to this Tottenham team. If he's allowed to play in the right position, I don't want to see him as a base deep line midfielder next to João Palhinha. I really don't think that will work. But I think if he's given the freedom to run, to press, to advance into the box, to crash the box late, then he's shown over his career that he can score goals and that he can create chances. I think a lot of people might be surprised to see the stats that Gallagher has shown over his career in terms of chances created and passes made and goals scored. he scored 8 goals for Chelsea in his last season, which would have been 4th top scorer for Spurs that season. In the Palace season, he would have been Tottenham's 3rd top scorer, behind only Kane and Son. So this is a guy that if you give him the ability in the final third to get in the right positions, I think he can really contribute to Tottenham.
Yeah, I've read a few descriptions about his style of play. I've also spoken to a very close friend of mine who's an expert in La Liga and who says that in all honesty, they were quite underwhelmed by what he did for Atletico Madrid. A bit harsh because he played a lot of games for them last season in particular, scored 5 times in 51 league games for Atletico. He is described as a box-to-box midfielder. He can play deeper, attack as well, according to those who have coached him. So in some regards, he's an all-round midfield player who has been compared with the likes of Ray Parlour and Frank Lampard. Tom mentioned his goal scoring stats: 8 in 72 for Chelsea, 6 in 26 for Charlton, none in 19 for Swansea, 2 in 30 at West Brom, those 8 goals that Tom mentioned when he played really well for Crystal Palace, and the 5-4 Atletico, and 35 million, Tom B. So if you like balancing the books, Brennan Johnson went for around 35 and he's come in for 35. We're back to where we started financially in January.
I suppose so, Marcus. Conor Gallagher is someone that I've followed a lot throughout his career because I used to cover the England under-21 team when he was the sort of a big part of that team. I remember interviewing him outside the stadium in our deepest, darkest Albania back in, I think, 2019, when Phil Foden scored a couple of goals. And this was when he was on loan at Charlton from Chelsea. I think it might have been his first loan, and the possibility of him going to Swansea on loan was there. So he was about 18, 19, and the main subject I was asking about was this heart issue that he had when he was younger. He had a heart, I think, a minor heart operation, which a lot of Spurs fans might not know. I think that could have been to do with a sort of irregular heartbeat. I have to go back over the notes, but he's someone who's shown a lot of grit and determination to get the most out of his career. Back when he was at Chelsea as a kid, he was the player of the year for the academy. The year before that I described. So he's come with a lot of pedigree. And all those loan spells you've mentioned, he's played in different positions. So West Brom, he was basically the holding midfielder in a relegation threatened team, I think, under Sam Allardyce, who ended up getting relegated. But then he went to Palace and he basically played as a number 10 later on, sort of replaced by Eberechi Eze when he went back to Chelsea under Thomas Tuchel, who's obviously now the England manager. But he really impressed that season. I did hear that Palace might have even tried to put a loan in this window. They've always really liked him. And then, as Tom rightly points out, Spurs have been interested in him for a couple of years, but I'm led to believe it was Daniel Levy who wasn't quite convinced. He went for James Maddison rather than either or both back in 2023. And then Postecoglou definitely wanted him last summer when he wanted more experience, but they didn't sign him then either, and he went to Atletico Madrid. I can understand why Atletico Madrid fans might be underwhelmed. I remember when he first signed, there was this amazing unveiling at the stadium. I think it was at night, where packed crowd. They all had their phones on. To make this massive, this sort of amazing atmosphere as he turned up. He was known as El Pitbull for his tenacious style. And yes, he racked up quite a few appearances in La Liga in particular, but actually when you look at it, more than half were from the substitute bench. So he never really won over Diego Simeone. So I think one of the things that I concur with a lot of things that Tom said. If they're looking for him to be this sort of Yuri Tillemans, kind of pull the strings from deep lying midfield, he's not that, Conor Gallagher. But as Tom said, the stats for his final season at Chelsea, there was a lot more creativity there than you might think. And this is a player who comes with a lot of hunger and determination and a sort of ready to sort of, with something to prove, I suppose, after how it went at Atletico. It was by no means a disaster, but it was, if he's leaving after 18 months, it wasn't a sort of rip-roaring success either. And then you've got to remember, from England's perspective, there's that final slot of the 4 for Tuchel's World Cup squad in midfield that still feels a bit up for grabs. I think Rice, Anderson and Henderson have got the 3 nailed down, and then the 4th one's probably Adam Wharton. There's a couple of others definitely ahead of Gallagher, but if he can have a really sort of barn-stopping second half of the season at Tottenham, then there's that there for him as well. But this is obviously a signing for the long term. It looks like it's going to be a 5.5-year deal, and I think there's no real downside to signing Conor Gallagher, as long as you're not expecting him to be a sort of Luka Modric type creator. You talked about Brennan Johnson a second ago. I don't want us to be going back to expecting things from players that they can't do and not focusing on what they can do. And I would say the same for Conor Gallagher.
Yeah, talking of England, he's got 22 caps, 1 goal, was in the squad both for the 2022 World Cup and Euro 2024. So he seems to peak at the right time in that regard. And just going back to what Tom said, under Pochettino, he was the captain at Chelsea. So that's an interesting connection potentially. And just looking forward to the rest of this window, what other type of players do you think Spurs might bring in? And goodness me, I know we're close to, if not having already completed the signing of this young left back, but with Richarlison out of action now, we've got to get another striker in, Tom A, haven't we?
Just a little bit more on Gallagher, because I was just wondering with the Poch thing, apart from the Poch connection, you speak to people at Chelsea, and they really speak glowingly about what Gallagher was like on and off the pitch. And they on the pitch they sort of say that he never hid in the tough moments. And maybe if you remember that Chelsea team that Poch was dealing with, and even before that, it was a really disparate team. And I think the way they kind of speak of Gallagher being a leader, even at that age, he's 25 now, so he was 22, 23. And the fact that Pochettino made him captain. I mean, I remember that instance, remember the Chelsea penalty spat with Madueke and Jackson. And actually, you kind of forget that Gallagher was the one in the middle there. So he basically got the ball and gave it to Palmer and pushed the other 2 guys away. I mean, he clearly has something about him, in that regard, on and off the pitch. And I personally think Spurs are really lacking that kind of thing. And I know it's not very fashionable these days because everyone loves to talk about data and the passing statistics and everything. And I know it's a huge part of the game now. Of course it is. But man management is still a huge part of football. It's still a massive part of the dressing room, the atmosphere, the unity in a team. And I think that Spurs' squad at the moment is lacking in those kind of characters. Leaders who you can rely on. Players who, to be honest, are sort of full throttle players that the fans will love to watch. We've talked a lot, in this season about the lack of kind of mavericks, but I also think we're slightly lacking in players who fans really want to get behind. And there's a bit of that in Palhinha's performance the other day, wasn't there? And I think that was really well received, both in the stadium and what I saw online as well, because ultimately, I think, is it sort of a bit sort of antiquated just to kind of say, actually, people like players who kind of get stuck in, and they're putting their body on the line and they're really into it, and you can see that it really means something to them, And I know this is all kind of old fashioned talk, but I think Gallagher is one of those players. And for what it's worth, we talk about Atleti and the fans being underwhelmed. The fans loved Gallagher, in the first season. They absolutely loved him on the pitch. I think overall, at the end, I think it's true to say that 40 million for Atleti was a pretty good deal. They were pretty happy with that. They basically bit Tottenham's hand off. But I think that says more about the kind of economic gap, to be honest. It's one of those things where Spurs see it as a good deal and Atleti see it as a good deal as well. And Atletico were playing 4-4-2, and in a 4-4-2 system, you can see why Gallagher doesn't quite have a role there. And I think that is going to be a challenge for Frank, even if in a 4-2-3-1. Does he play in the base, which I think is not ideal? Can he play as the 10? And if he can, you're sort of playing with a pressing, slightly defensive number 10, to be honest, when Xavi Simons is clearly the guy that you probably want to get behind in this team. Can you play him off the wide play off the flanks? I don't think so. So I just wonder, what is his role in this team going to be? Will we see Frank possibly be bold enough even to kind of change it a little bit and make it more of a 4-3-3, where you can rely on someone like Palhinha as kind of a lone pivot, and then you have Xavi Simons and Gallagher as almost like an 8 and 10, or almost like twin 10s, which might be quite nice, the way Gallagher's sort of direct bombing into the box. Then you've got Xavi who kind of wants to come deeper and play. I think that could work. I don't know if Frank has quite got the daring to do it. So I am interested to see where he fits in terms of the team.
Can I just come in there about a couple of points? First of all, you mentioned, Tom, about his leadership, and that's definitely something that I feel is lacking at Spurs, and I think Thomas Frank thinks that too. He keeps talking about character when he talks about potential new signings, and you mentioned that Chelsea final season. If you go back and look at that performance against, ironically, Aston Villa, the team that wanted to sign him, both that window and obviously recently, and Spurs, obviously hijacked it. There was a game against Villa towards the end of the season where Villa sort of romped into a 2-0 lead. Pochettino was really under pressure, and Chelsea came back, and they ultimately drew rather than winning because they had a goal disallowed right at the end. But Gallagher scored in that game, and it was a proper captain's performance. He was brilliant. And this was around the time where there was a lot of talk about Chelsea getting rid of him, despite him coming through the ranks at Chelsea. And I think, if he can bring that kind of performance to Spurs, not every game because you can't expect it all the time. And that is exactly what Tom's talking about, that leadership, that kind of character that Frank wants, that kind of standing up and be counted and not shying away. You know, we've been a little bit critical of Wilson Odobert, for example. He's a young player. He's clearly got a lot of talent, but at times you wonder if he really wants to go or if he's a bit timid to go and show it. Whereas I don't think Gallagher, with the experience he's had, will have that kind of side of things. And regarding where he'll play, I suppose it will just most likely be a number 8. And I think his discipline that he brings means that it would be a bit easier to play a Paulinho as a sort of lone holding midfielder alongside Gallagher than it would be with maybe some of the other options, Archie, for example. And just finally, talk about Poch and how much he was a big fan of Gallagher. Well, I mean, there is a manager in the dugout at the moment in Thomas Frank, and it doesn't surprise me to see that. I think Matt Law's done a piece today in the Telegraph about how basically Frank having a conversation with Gallagher is what swayed him between Aston Villa and Chelsea, because they could have gone to both clubs. I do think like he had quite an influence, and you could look at it and think, well, why would he pick Spurs over Aston Villa at the moment, given where Villa are in the league? And it looks like Kamara, that injury that he picked up against Spurs, might actually be quite bad. So I imagine he would have got game time there, but he seems to have bought into this project as much as players realise that they can't sign just for a manager, because it can change very quickly, and he will, he's not stupid. He will look at the fixtures ahead and realise the pressure that there is. But I think it should be mentioned that it seems like Frank had quite an influence and a role to play in this signing.
I mean, I don't want to go overboard. I have to say, Mark, I feel like we're being slightly gushing about Gallagher, and I think he's a good signing. I think it's worth saying that we're all aware of his limitations, and that probably in a top 4 team that's really doing well, that's thriving, let's say in 3 or 4 years under Thomas Frank still, maybe they move on from Gallagher and he's maybe a squad player, that kind of thing. But I think at this point in time, I think he could be a useful addition, that's for sure.
I mean, it's really interesting, and Frank does perhaps need to show more tactical flexibility. So exactly where he fits into the starting 11 is going to be intriguing. Hopefully we'll get a little indication as to what the long-term plan is against West Ham at the weekend. Just on the subject of the transfer, again, it's great if Thomas Frank's got that much persuasive power, particularly when you hear in some areas that he might have lost part of the Spurs dressing room already. But it also does seem as though part of the issue of the transfer was that Aston Villa wanted to take him on loan initially. Spurs were prepared to buy him straight away. So how significant that was, I don't know. But in terms of the other question I posed just a few moments ago, who else might come? We are, I think, looking for a striker, but then somebody who's got a bit of leadership instinct as well. I mean, there aren't many available strikers around, never mind a striker who's also got great leadership qualities. So are there any other names out there, guys, that maybe we can get excited about? And I'll throw in one in a moment who's not an out-and-out striker, but who Georgia a few months ago said would be an ideal asset. But Tommy, got any possible suggestions for us?
I mean, I think in terms of positions, Spurs are definitely looking for that kind of more creative, progressive passing midfielder, not just because Bentancur is injured, but I think they were anyway. There was a sort of a feeling this is a really priority position, but they're sort of looking at it across the next 2 transfer windows. And I think in part that's because, to be honest, it's very difficult to make a really key signing like that in January, and actually the market is sort of suggesting generally that you speak to people that it feels like there's a bit of a clamour at the moment for that position, and a bit like we had 2 or 3 years ago when Caicedo and Rice, I think, went maybe in the same summer. That maybe this summer it's going to be a similar thing with Wharton, with Elliot Anderson, for example, where there are 2 or 3 really big clubs who are wanting sort of, let's call them sort of deep-lying midfielders, and there could be a bit of a rush on it. So I don't think it's going to be easy to solve that problem in this January transfer window, I have to say. I think that probably goes for the position of striker as well. I know that Spurs were looking for a left-sided defender, which you would think is probably being sold by Sousa coming in. But equally, obviously, you'd say he's sort of, of the profile of a kind of more a future signing. So whether or not they still think they could do with someone else in that position is a possibility. I think they'll also be focusing in the last couple of weeks, I don't know what Tom thinks and what he's heard, but on outgoings, and there are 2 or 3. I was told 2 or 3 weeks ago that this could be a big window for sales, that they were sort of losing a lot of patience with some fringe players. And I think, we can all guess who that might be. I mean, Johnson's gone. Bissouma, clearly, I think they want to sell this January. Dragusin, for example. There are players, I think, who they will definitely be looking to shift in this January. And that might be the more busier end of the second couple of weeks.
Just on the subject, sorry, Tom, on the subject of the left-back situation, I think now that Davis has come back in and shown what he can do, that to me is not a priority at the moment. I'm still looking as well as an out-and-out striker, and I appreciate that's difficult. I mean, people mention Jan Diomande at Leipzig, but by all accounts, he's a massive Liverpool fan, and he's got his heart set on going there. So that's a little bit fanciful. But can I throw in the one name that George mentioned after we played them in the Champions League a few months ago? And that's the Monaco player Magnus Akliouche, who I don't know whether he's available. I got the impression reading a couple of reports that Monaco are sort of getting ready to try and replace him because they feel that he might go sooner rather than later. And would he not be an ideal fit on the left-hand side? We tried so many players in that area. Sorry, Tom, but I interrupted you then.
No. Sorry, I hope you can't hear my dog barking in the background. Someone's come to the door, so they'll have to wait. Akliouche was definitely someone they looked at, but I thought that was more for the number 10 position in the summer. I mean, maybe if he can play off out wide or off the flank, then that might change things. They're definitely they've been looking at a left winger. That's been blindingly obvious. Obviously after Antoine Semenyo, that didn't happen. It's hard. I mean, with January, I know fans, the last thing they want to hear is how hard the window is, but you often look at the players that move, and they're the ones, it's because they need game time, particularly if they've got international aspirations with a major tournament at the end of the season. I mean, Gallagher is a prime example of that. It's going to be hard to get someone like Wharton or Anderson out of their clubs right now because that's one thing they don't have to worry about. They're in a really settled environment. Probably why Mark Guehi might end up staying. Or possibly, I guess someone might force Palace's hand given that he's on a free transfer in the summer. But that does come into it. We went through some of the names the other day. Savinho's injured for a while at City. Oscar Bob, it sounds like he's injured, but also I'm not sure City Spurs are definitely interested. One player that has been mooted and is someone that Spurs have looked at, I'm not saying they're going to sign him, is Samu Agahawa, if I pronounce it right, at Porto. He is a striker. He's been mentioned a couple of windows now. So maybe there's someone like that who might come out of the woodwork. But also, you got to remember, Tom talks about outgoings. So Dragusin, first of all, I'd almost be not surprised if he was still there after the window, but a lot of the noise seems to be, even his agent's been talking, his agent often talks, but his agent's been talking about when Roma put in a loan bid, which Spurs ended up rejecting, the idea that he and his client Dragusin were waiting to find out what Spurs wanted to do, but it doesn't seem like Dragusin has a long-term future, which is strange at Spurs, given I think he actually fits Frank's style quite a lot. But from the noises we're hearing, it feels like he's more likely to go than stay. Obviously mentioned Bissouma. That's just a matter of if they can find a buyer, really. I do think, you mentioned Ben Davis, but at his age, I think they do desperately need to look at left back, at least for the future. And this Sousa player, I can't claim to know too much about him, apart from the fact he's very, very quick and he's a teenager at Brazil and plays for Neymar Santos. But maybe that kind of signing, if they see a lot of potential in him, that makes sense because he's not going to be expected to do everything straight away. He can sort of blood himself in. And I wouldn't be surprised if that deal got wrapped up this week. But also you've got Mathys Tel, for example. I mean, you must have noticed a lot of the talk at the moment surrounding Tel about Paris FC, who, to be honest, I hadn't heard much about really in a couple of weeks ago. And I see they've beaten PSG I think it was last night in the French Cup, and they've been recently promoted, and they've clearly got quite an ambitious club. And there's quite a lot of talk about Tel being open to a loan move because he wants to get into the French squad, which is no mean feat given the players they've got. But Spurs right now, I've listened to the reaction pod that you guys did, Tom and George, discussing this subject. They can ill afford to let someone like that go. But if they go and sign someone in that position, and there's been talk about in Germany about Tel wanting to play centre forward rather than out wide, and that possibly being part of the reason why he might be open to a loan move. But if they were to go and sign someone, what would that be a message to him? So there are quite a few different balls up in the air right now.
You're on mute, Marcus. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I muted myself there. Yeah, and there's been a lot of criticism of Matthias Tell, but I think there have been enough signs of late that would make that really disappointing if he was to be offloaded at this stage. We'll see. Yeah, you mentioned Aggie Howard, by the way, if we got his name right, from Porto. He's only 21. I think he scored something like 19 goals in 25 games this season. So he clearly is one for the future. The January transfer window is potentially risky. We all know that. You can get some great players, and I immediately think of Bentancur and Kulusevski from a couple of seasons ago. I know, Tom B, that you've drawn up an interesting list of some of the good deals, yes, and some of the not so good deals that Spurs have been involved in this month, in years gone by. Would you care to refresh our memory?
Gordon Bennett, how long are you going back through
Look
it,
at
Tom?
that. Well, I decided. I mean, to be fair, I did kind of rush through this just before we went on. From 2002 2003, because apparently I think that's when the January transfer window became a thing. So apologies if I've missed a few. To be fair, under the Poch years, you probably won't be surprised to see, unless I've missed them, there are hardly any. There are hardly any signings during that period, I guess, but there were only a handful. Where do you want me to start? Well,
Start with the worst ones.
Well, first of all, I'll give you a quiz question to begin with. Who is the one player that Tottenham have signed twice, if I remembered it right, in January?
Jermaine Defoe.
It is Jermaine Defoe. Yeah, he was signed in the second January transfer window ever in 2004, and then he signed again in January 2009, and that was the window. Obviously, Harry had come in, picked it up from 2 points from 8 games, and made a number of signings that window. In fact, another quiz question, Marcus and Tom: who are the other 4 players they signed there? Because they're all quite well known.
Oh,
in which January?
In
This is Harry's
2009,
first window, 2009.
Peter Crouch.
No, I'll give it to you anyway because dead air is no good on radio. Pascal Chimbonda, Jermaine Defoe, Carlo Cudicini, Wilson Palacios, and Robbie Keane in the end. Which I would say that's a good window. January windows goes. That's probably the best of the lot, wouldn't you say? I mean, I know Bentancur and Kulusevski in 2022 are 2 very good players. I'd say Bentancur he has had a problem with injury, hasn't he, and other issues that meant that he's missed games. But he is a good player, even if he's not shown as much recently. But Kulusevski, well, I suppose you could say the same thing about him with his injury record. But those 2 are undoubtedly very good signings. But yeah, that was probably the busiest window. Interestingly, the window before that, January prior to that, Jonathan Woodgate signed. Was that when he signed? Was he on loan at that point and he signed permanently for Middlesbrough, or did he just get it? I'm trying to remember now. But he obviously went on to win. He obviously went on to score the winner, didn't he?
You have to tell us, Tom, you're going to be asking us these questions in advance so that we can go and look at the answers.
Yeah, we don't look so stupid.
Like we know what we're talking about, rather than exposing.
I'm normally the one who doesn't know the Tottenham history, but you guys are showing yourselves right now.
These are some quite tough questions, to be honest, Tom, I would suggest.
Fair enough. I have a very distinct memory of the 2012 January window because I went to see Newcastle with my season ticket supporting Tottenham Hotspur mate in the Spurs end and saw you batter us 5-0. And I'm not sure if Louis Sahar and Ryan Nelson were playing, but those were the ones you picked up on basically free transfers, and people were decrying Spurs' poor business. But you still managed to smash my beloved Newcastle 5-0 that day. So,
those were the days.
From there, that was the problem. It all unravelled, didn't it? After that January, that was the crunch point.
There was a lot of Harry, we want you to stay at that point because there was a lot of England talk, wasn't there? And then it all sort of unravelled. But
I mean, just a point about the January window. I mean, that good one that Redknapp did, it makes me think, like, was it maybe easier, like 10, 15 years ago in January? Because there was still a sort of more of a hierarchy in the Premier League, I think, where the bigger clubs could kind of poach from the lower teams, and it was possible to kind of buy sort of plug and play Premier League players pretty easily in January if you thought there was someone lower down. Whereas now, you want to sign Adam Wharton now, you've got to pay 100 million in January, right? And I think that landscape has changed. I don't know when someone first said that the January window is a difficult window, but I reckon it was probably about 2015 or something,
Yeah.
I asked you for the worst signings, Tom. I don't know if you can trump these, and I'm pretty sure they all were January signings. And Toda, the Japanese player, I I just about recall him arriving and maybe playing one game. Ricardo Rocha. I mean,
That was the
one of
one. That January window,
one of
that
the
was
worst.
06, 07. As far as I can tell, you signed Ben Anik, the goalkeeper, for about 900 grand, and Ricardo Rocha in total it was 4.2 million. That's not a great window, is it really? But I mean, Timo Werner lost the first January. I mean, I suppose he was okay for the rest of that season. It was more the loan the second season. But looking back now, that January window for Ange after they'd made this amazing start and then injuries kicked in and they signed Timo Werner and they looked on paper, they'd beaten like a good signing in Dragusin, they'd beaten Bayern Munich to his signing. But if he ends up leaving, I mean, it's hard to sort of draw a conclusion on Dragusin because if he ends up staying and he could be an effective player because there is talent there. But if he ends up moving this month, you can't really look at that one as a real strong window, can you really? I mean, the ones that stand out, Pedro Porro under Conte, I think that's been proven to be a good signing. To get someone like that in January is very good. Dele Alli, albeit it went back to MK Dons. Michael Dawson. I mean, there have been various examples, I would say, of Tottenham doing well in January.
I'm surprised you haven't mentioned the left back Gilberto. I mean, it's another one that we need to gloss over. Stephen Pienaar. Don't think he did a lot when he arrived. I think I'm right in saying that Danny Murphy, Andy Reid, and
Yes.
Yunus Kabul were all January transfer signings as well.
Yeah,
So it's
and
nice.
Andy Reid was a very exciting signing. I remember that. It was at the time it was a real sort of bit of a coup.
Well, he was basically Dawson's mate, wasn't he? That was the reason he came.
Mm.
But anyway, let us hope we're going to add a couple of good names to that list. I'll throw in Mido. I had a good Johnson as well. Michael Brown. You never know what you're going to get, do you? And there is still time for Spurs. Now, listen, this pod is primarily about what you have been saying to us, and we really do. And we say it every week, but it's absolutely true. We love your comments on Spotify. You know, there's so many different ways to get in touch with us these days, and Tom is very good at that. Loads of questions, loads of suggestions. Let us start this portion, gents, with Thomas Frank's situation, because there are plenty who want him out, of course. There are actually a fair few writing to us who don't want to see him go yet, at least. Let me start with a couple that are not so complimentary of the current manager. Jack, 1906, says, the quote, better to be a lucky coach than a good one, unfortunately means nothing here because he's neither. And Jack goes on to list how Thomas Frank has called out the fans, saying some of them can't be true supporters because of what they've been saying, mentions the Coffeegate incident at Bournemouth, and says that Frank is essentially too honest with his assessment of Spurs as a club. Yeah, I mean, I think those are all fair points. Laura Lovejoy, many others say, yeah, okay, he's got to go, but who on earth should replace him? MMDCT says that we should not sack him until the end of the season, as there are not a lot of managerial options right now. He might be good enough to at least get us a Europa League place in the meantime. Baptizel says, stop changing the manager. The players we have are not good enough. We should expect inconsistency. He says that essentially we are a poor man's Chelsea. Gordon Feeney, Spurs would be crazy to think about getting rid of him. He needs at least another season to really make a mark. So there's a whole mix. And actually, I got the impression reading all these comments, guys, that it's perhaps not quite as one-sided as maybe if you just go on social media, you would think it to be, because there are a lot of outspoken people there who want to see the back of him. Where shall we start with this? Tom B, he's seen us go out the cup. We've got West Ham at home at the weekend. We've got Burnley away the week after that. And we'll come on to the conversation as to whether relegation is actually a serious issue in just a few moments' time. But listening to the pod at the weekend, and George was very good on this in particular, it does seem to me as though unless something disastrous happens, he's going to stay for now at least. Is that the right move from your point of view?
Well, I've consistently said that any manager needs at least a season, so it'd be kind of hypocritical of me to backtrack on that now. But I think it is fair to say it's been underwhelming, at the very least. His campaign so far, the only real positive has been the Champions League campaign, which they look in a very good position to maybe even come into the top 8. But going out of both cups, the league performances, admittedly, there's still, is it 6 points to 5th? But with some of the performances they've shown at home, there is little to really give you confidence that that gap won't widen. Away form has been good, I suppose, and there have been little things like improving set pieces. That's, well, I say little thing. It's a massive thing in the modern game, but it's the style of play that's bothered fans more than anything than results. But having said that, the last couple of games, I actually thought they've played better. I really do. I do think he's taking it on board. The feedback that the fans have been giving him, brutally at matches. I do think Bournemouth was a good performance. It was heartbreaking, but it was a good performance. When you look at the underlying numbers, they easily could have won that game. Same goes for. The same goes for Aston Villa, because this first half, at half time, like you guys said on the Erection Pod, really did feel like end of day stuff. It was the massive fear was that they were going to go on and lose 4 or 5-0, and it was going to be just horrendous to be in that stadium and see what kind of abuse he was going to come under. But the response gave you real hope that this team is fighting for him, that he can still make things happen, and for that reason alone. It's worth sticking with it. The one thing I would say, and I very much get the idea that the hierarchy are supporting him and want to support him, want to make this work. They're backing that up with the way they're making moves in the transfer market. They're getting rid of Brennan Johnson because Frank doesn't completely believe he's the long-term answer. They're now making a move in Conor Gallagher. That's all well and good, though. If they go and lose to West Ham on the weekend at home in a game that's been branded El Sacico by former manager Tim Sherwood, I'm not saying that he will get sacked off the back of that, but with Burnley after that, with Borussia Dortmund sandwiched in between, that's when the supporters really do start to make their voices heard, not just in what they say and what they chant in games, but by who goes to the matches. I mean, look at the tickets for, is it Newcastle and Man City in February? They're on general sale. That is quite rare for a premium games like that. And I think tickets are going at four tickets per person. Again, that's pretty rare. So that shows you that the level of interest, admittedly with expensive tickets in a cost of living crisis, but the level of interest is not quite what it was, and maybe that will be the thing that makes a difference. But I come back to what I said about the last couple of performances. I feel like there are positives there to definitely to prolong and see where he can be come the end of the season after this January transfer window.
Okay, listen, I've got a few specific questions that I'm going to throw at both of you in turn now, questions from our listeners. Before that, just a quick one, actually, in terms of attendances, it's going to be fascinating to see how many people turn up for the Champions League game next week. I know the club are very concerned that there's going to be quite a paltry number for what's a huge game in many ways. Jay Redgrave got in touch. If you read the media, it's all negative, negative, negative. The fact is, I'm a season ticket holder who goes to most away games. What the vast majority want is to see Frank backed. We all know he doesn't have Kane, Kulo and Son playing up front. He's having to deal with an ever-changing, developing midfield, a defence without a left-footed defender for vast majority of the season as well. Well, Van de Ven, of course, has played a lot of that, so I might quibble about that one. But he says, those who boo are the same Levy-out idiots, always looking to blame people apart from the players. We have seen improvement in the last couple of games, as Tom just said. I'm firmly Frank in as long as he gets the tools to build his team, and judging by the speed in which they booted out Johnson, that's precisely what is going to happen. But Tom A. Sunday Okai 3809 says, why can't we play like we did in the second half against Aston Villa on a regular basis? Is it down to a lack of confidence, a lack of ability, or the instructions being given to the players by the manager?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always suspicious, I have to say, of the kind of rousing reaction to being 2-0 down. I always think when a team is sort of has nothing to lose, it's all very well kind of delivering a kind of spirited 20 or 30 minutes, but actually the game was all but gone, right? I mean, Villa were 2-0 up and away, and I mean, I sort of push back, I think, on those fans, and George mentioned it at the weekend, the idea that the players are just sort of letting loose and almost freeing themselves from the Frank shackles and doing what they wanted. I don't think that's the case. I would also say maybe the idea they were kind of fighting for Frank. I mean, it's very possible that it's sort of neither of those things. And actually, you know, as always with these situations, the squad is a number of different players feeling a number of different things. And I suspect some of them are quite loyal to Thomas, and some of them probably are very much not, you know, and I think that's probably where the team is at. I sort of think Tom's been quite generous there, I have to say, with the last performances. The idea that they were good, I mean, I think they were better, you know, and the numbers were better. You know, we look at the shots against Bournemouth, you know, 16, I think it was, which I think was the highest of the season, or joint at least. They created more chances. I think Xavi Simons' performance against Villa was particularly encouraging, and I really think that he is going to be the key if Frank is going to survive. But guys, let's be honest. I mean, you know, they're 14th, you know, and they're out of both cups, so there's no chance of them winning a trophy. The football has been poor. We've said before, it's hard to circle a single player really in the squad who's got better under Frank. You know, I think Richarlison is probably the only one. And then you're sort of grasping at fitness straws, you know. And to be fair, actually, I mean, I think that shouldn't be underestimated. I do think Van de Ven playing so much is a credit to Frank and the fitness team this season, because that really wasn't a given last season. But if you think about, and I think I said this the other day, you think about the things that the club thought they were getting with Frank, you know, someone who could build culture, develop players, progressive style. Like, of those three things, how many of those things has he delivered in 6 months? And lots of people will say, well, 6 months isn't enough. And maybe that's true, but you'd like to see some signs of those things being delivered. And I don't think on culture, style, or development, I don't think Frank has delivered yet, you know. So is it enough to remove him at this point? I think probably not. You know, I think he still deserves more time to kind of show those things. But I think it's fair that he's under pressure. I think it's fair that he's being asked tough questions. You know, I think it's fair that we're discussing it, and I think it's fair that lots of fans are feeling like they are, you know, and maybe, you know, it's always really difficult, isn't it? Because I always think the booing is louder than the silence, right? You know, probably there is a sort of middling majority of Tottenham fans who are probably a little bit like us and are very disappointed with the way it is, but also wondering what the alternative is mid-season and whether it's just kind of worth sticking through at the moment. Because you look at Manchester United, for example, who have, you know, a lot of sort of ready-made interim managers from the golden years or whatever. I don't really know who Tottenham's kind of go-to interims are, you know. And if you said to me there was 2 or 3, you know, other really good coaches available, you know, and Xabi Alonso is now available, I guess, but I think he's going to want a bit of a break. And I mean, people did mention this, you know, on social. And the one thing to say about Alonso is if you had him as coach, you'd always be wondering when he was going to go off to Liverpool. That's the problem, isn't it, with that one? I mean, he's clearly a fantastic coach and what a prospect. But, you know, if he did 2 or 3 great years at Tottenham, and I suspect he'll think it's a bit of a sort of Bayer Leverkusen job, the Tottenham job. I think he probably now thinks of himself as a super club manager. But whatever he did at Spurs, he would then be, you know, immediately linked with Liverpool. So I don't know if that's particularly helpful. But bottom line, guys, I just don't think there's not a compelling option, is there, in the middle of the season to go to. So I think the best thing, unless it really unravels, like Tom says, in the next 3 or 4 games where they've got winnable matches, I think they have to stick.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's worth highlighting as well that it was a really tough cup draw. Okay, we're Tottenham Hotspur. We should back ourselves to beat anybody. But actually, at the moment, in the current scenario, Aston Villa at home was just about as bad as it could have been. And, well, we know
And
what happened.
Newcastle in the Carabao as well, Marcus.
Yeah,
Both.
they've not been lucky in that regard. Sticking with a tactical theme, Tom B, Eugene Kaladiva. Now these stats might be a week or 2 old, but he wrote this just a few days ago and said that Spurs had managed 9 through balls up until the point that he wrote it, and that may be just before the Bournemouth game, but within the last week or so. And he compares that to Manchester City, who at the same stage had come up with 73. And this, I think, is what all the fans want to stress. You don't want to go around sacking managers all the time, and the results might not be perfect, particularly when the squad is not at the highest level. But we want to be entertained to a degree. And those figures are not good enough, are they?
No. And if things don't go how we just sort of suggested they might play out, and he is sacked in a couple of weeks, that image of him holding the Arsenal Cup will be the abiding image, sadly, and that statistic, I think, will be the statistic that fans will identify with Thomas Frank looking back. It's up to him to change that narrative, but it's just not been creative enough. It's been way too boring at times, way too unambitious. I do think that stat may well have come before the Bournemouth game, because I haven't checked the numbers, but definitely in the Bournemouth game, I noticed a lot more progressive passes just in the first half than there had been. So low bar to get above. And, I think I've said that so many times. There's a low bar we're trying to get over here. And that Tom saying I'm being too generous, I mean, I'm just quite a glass half full kind of guy, to be honest, a bit like George. But there's no
That's
doubt.
not true, Tom. I've seen you at press conferences in the last few weeks, and you don't look like a half glass full kind of guy. Your head slumped on the desk.
That's another conversation about how sometimes Thomas is quite hard work to get him to speak about certain things. Although I actually feel like he's better.
Marcus, you should have seen after Bournemouth away, there was a press conference. I think it was, what time was it, Tom? Was it midday or something? The next day, it was Bournemouth was Wednesday night, I think, and the next day, Thursday at sort of 11 or something. I came in and you could literally, there were about 10 people, and you could tell all the people who had been at Bournemouth away, the bags under their eyes, it looked like sort of like ghosts.
Yeah, that's nothing against Thomas Frank. That's just the schedule. People don't talk about the journalists. They'll talk about the players getting injured. But what are the journalists? They travel all this.
You should have all had a few more cups of coffee. Just made sure they weren't in Arsenal mugs.
What a hard life. But anyway, back to that statistic. I think there was another one about how in number of games of late, including definitely the Brentford game, you had one player for the opposition in that game. It was Jordan Henderson having more progressive passes than the entire Tottenham midfield. And you can't tell me that that's because of the quality of Tottenham's midfielders. Like, they played a completely different style under Ange. Yes, okay, that didn't work for a lot. So, we don't want to go over that again, but it has to come down to the manager and what he's telling the players to do and how ambitious he's telling them to be. But I feel like that may have changed of late, and yeah, I'll come back to it. It's on him to continue that trend, because there is, as I've said again, there's a reason why this podcast is called the Tottenham Way. There is an expectation at this club. There's an expectation in this club. There are other clubs where it's similar. I mean, playing West Ham at the weekend, there's a similarity there as well. I mean, losing David Moyes looks like absolutely staggering sort of act of self-sabotage on West Ham's from West Ham's perspective, and it clearly is. But there was a reason why the fans, particularly the first time, kind of wanted him out, because of over the course of time, his style isn't the most entertaining, and they want to be entertained. They're one of those clubs who really wants to be entertained, and Spurs are arguably even more so. So you can't play that way long term and be a success at Tottenham unless you're winning every game, and they're not doing that at the moment.
Couple more questions for you about Thomas Frank, one each. Tom, a grumpy Spurs fan, says, is there an element of the Spurs players not respecting Frank because he was never a top player? Which is an interesting question, but if you think about it, over the past few years, there have been a lot of very successful managers who haven't been top players. But is that a potential vulnerability for him?
Yeah, it's an interesting question from Grumpy. I think, to be honest, I think in the big clubs, I think there is a certain kudos that you have with having a career, having a distinguished career. You look at the managers who have been really successful in the Premier League, and generally, a lot of them have had, very distinguished careers, because you have that kind of kudos with the players. You have that weight in the dressing room, right? I think the second thing you probably need is to have some kind of experience of a big club, and that's why I tend to think now the jump to, let's say, one of the big six clubs in the Premier League is much easier to make from a big club, in inverted commas, from abroad, to then make that jump across, rather than making it upwards through the Premier League. I looked into this in detail a few weeks ago about the managers who have kind of gone up from lower down in the division in the Premier League, and actually, hardly any of them have really been successes. Poch was really one of the only ones. You might say Rodgers, Redknapp, but there are countless others, Hodgson, Potter, all of Nuno, of course, who really have not made a good fist of basically doing well at lower clubs in the league and then not doing well at the top. And I think part of that is because I think it's hard to command a dressing room in the higher echelons of the Premier League when you've come from a club like Brentford, or you've come from a club like, let's say Bournemouth, for example. I think that also translates to the fans. I think one of the big things that is difficult for these coaches coming from the smaller teams is immediately feeling the support of the fans, because they have so much less credit in the bank. If it's Conte or Mourinho who take over Spurs and they start badly, then of course, the fans think, well, yeah, but he's, won a couple of titles with Chelsea, and he, won the treble with Porto, so we better give him time. If you come from a lower club, you immediately have to kind of hit the ground running. Otherwise, you're immediately under pressure. I think it's more important what you've done as a manager rather than necessarily having a career as a player. There are more and more kind of academic, geek coaches who basically quit early the game, and went into sort of study, various degrees. I mean, Tuchel, one of them, Klopp, Hertzler. There are lots of managers who have done really well taking that route. So I think it does help to have been a fantastic player, no doubt. I think the more important thing, to be honest, is to have had some pedigree as a coach. Otherwise, it's a really difficult jump to make.
Just in addition to that, I mean, the sort of one example I can think of someone who sort of fits your profile that you're talking about, who is a bit of a different character, is Roberto De Zerbi, who has been linked to the Tottenham job. There's even talk of Fabio Paratici wanted him. Maybe, I'm not sure if that's definitely the case, but he's quite a sort of volatile character. So he obviously is at Marseille at the moment. Brighton before. Maybe you could make an argument that would have been a similar leap to Tottenham from Brentford with Thomas Frank. Didn't have an amazing career. Wasn't a bad midfielder, I think, but he didn't have an amazing playing career. But he's quite a sort of combustible character, isn't it? I mean, if it's a matter of gaining the respect from the players, can you sort of go in all guns blazing like he sort of does, or is people think of him as doing, and try and gain the respect in that way, rather than being maybe Thomas Frank's sort of slightly more nice approach. But then that sort of can lead to sort of blow-ups, like we've when he was at Brighton. Robert Sanchez, who's now the Chelsea goalkeeper, basically got binned by De Zerbi. Same goes for I think at Marseille he's had a few issues with players there too. So it must be quite a tough mood or tough sort of note to sort of strike as a manager coming into those circumstances when you're not sure, you haven't got the playing career behind you. And I definitely think that is a thing. At least gives you an initial sort of vote of confidence, I suppose, from a playing squad. But also, I think more importantly, what Tom says, where you've come as a manager. But if you go in and think, all right, I'm going to sort of be my way or the highway, Antonio Conte style, who obviously did have the playing career and the manager career to back it up, like that is one way of doing it, but it risks losing players quite quickly. And obviously players are not, from a club's perspective, it's not just about what's performances on the pitch. They're also assets. Like, think of Robert Sanchez. Yeah, he did finally get that move to Chelsea, but at the time he was being mooted as like a £50 million goalkeeper who suddenly got sort of reduced to the bench. Rightly or wrongly, it sounds like he was a difficult character. And they end up selling him for 25 million. From a club's perspective, that's like quite a loss on a transfer fee that they could have had. So that's difficult. And to be fair to Thomas Frank, I mean, we don't know what he's like behind closed doors with the squad. He could be way more demonstrative, way more authoritative. I'm sure he's authoritative. He could be more hard line, I suppose, than what we're seeing. And I do suspect that might be the case, that he does have a different face to us in the media, where he just tries to be.
Although, Tom, I mean, it is worth saying that, discipline has obviously been a huge problem.
Romero is the key thing.
Yes.
Romero, but I mean, he's not the only one, right?
But the fact that they haven't fined him, and they haven't obviously stripped him of his captaincy would be next level. Well, to not even fine him after that. That is where people will start asking questions about his authority, having not done that. Sorry, I interrupted.
I'm going to come on to that in a moment when we talk about the running of the club. And there was another example, at the end of the game at the weekend when, Polinia, I think quite rightly, got stuck into Ollie Watkins. But it's a further indication, perhaps, that there's a growing level of ill discipline within the club. Before we move on to the running of the club and indeed the possibility of relegation, Lee Saunders wants a different philosophy from Frank and from Spurs in general. He wants the focus now to be on developing a young squad. I think he's saying this in particular because effectively there's not a huge amount left to play for this season unless we're about to embark on an incredible Champions League run. And I do think it's worth stressing we are incredibly still only 6 points off fifth place. You beat West Ham and Burnley, and these are big ifs at the moment. But if you do, okay, there's some very tough fixtures thereafter, but suddenly you're only 2 or 3 points away from a Champions League spot again. But he wants to see this development of youngsters. He mentions Vuskovic, VDV, Tell, Donnelly, Divine, Kinski. And it's interesting, we've had quite a few of you writing in, primarily moaning about Vicario's distribution. but also about his goalkeeping in general. And I do get the impression that there's a growing trend amongst many who would like to see Kinski given a prolonged run in the side. And Saunders says, obviously, you have a few old heads around them, the likes of Polini, to give some guidance. But, boys, is this the time to give youth its chance and salvage something from a pretty desperate season? Tom, eh?
I mean, always yes, because I think there's always such value in playing players from the academy. You just get that feel immediately, that connection with the fans, which is what's been missing for so long. Whether there are players ready for that chance is another debate, and it's very difficult for us to know. We don't see them every day in training. If we don't see them in matches, well, it's hard for us to know if they're ready to play, right? But I do think Frank, for example, the other day, he brought on Dane Scarlett in that game, perhaps out of necessity, because we know Richarlison was injured and Solanke perhaps wasn't ready for a longer stint. Could he have brought on Williams Barnett as well? Would that have kind of sent the stadium wild, and would have really generated the kind of noise for the last 10, 15 minutes, perhaps as well? But I have to say, I slightly push back on the idea there's nothing to play for in this season. You mentioned they're 6 points off. Is it fourth or fifth? I mean, they're not playing fifth. You're putting your five fingers up. I mean, they're not playing like they can get that position, are they? But there is still, there's still a European place to play for. Even if they don't get into the Champions League, Spurs could perhaps get back into the Europa League. And what a run that was last year. I think we're kind of beyond that point now where we think the Europa League is not worth getting into. Spurs should be really going for those European places, even if the Champions League moves a bit out of sight. And I mean, actually, I think that's an interesting aspect about the Frank debate. Is the fact they're 6 points off a reason for keeping him, or is it a reason for thinking, actually, if we got someone else in and we have a bit of a tailwind, maybe they could push back up into those places, And I mean, and it's the kind of thing that probably in 2 or 3 weeks is not going to be an option, because I think at some point the pack is going to be 10, 12 points away, and then it's gone. But I think there's still enough to say that you don't just throw in all the kids, and I think it's something that when you're sort of desperate and looking at the situation, you think nothing can get better. You think, well, just play all the academy boys. But actually, the reality is, if they lost 2 or 3 games on the spin, you kill them. And actually, that's not really good for development at all. On Kinski, I have to say I'm not convinced by Kinski. And I don't know if I'm seeing something different to what everyone else is seeing, because I see a lot of support for him and saying that he should get games. I have to say that in the games I've seen him, I think he had a good start when he came in, but actually then he kind of tailed off. When he's played, he's made mistakes. I don't see him as a ready-made replacement for Vicario, who I admit can be infuriating. One of Vicario's most irritating habits, by the way, is the way he dallies on the ball. Sometimes when Spurs get the ball and there's a sort of a momentum and there's a swell from the crowd and they want to go on the break, and he does that thing where he sort of looks one way, and then he comes back, looks the other. It's almost like it's performative. It's like he sort of wants to look as though he's having a decision to make and he wants to have a bit more time in the limelight. Get the ball, roll it out, mate. Let's get going. I can see why people are losing a bit of patience with Vicario, but I have to say I don't think Kinski is the answer.
Can I just chime in on Vicario? I mean, yeah, he's definitely someone that polarizes opinion, and he's just a bit of a paradox, isn't he? Because he's had the games like Monaco this season where if it weren't for him, Spurs definitely would have lost. He's had some good moments, but with the ball at his feet, it's even starting to frustrate his teammates. I mean, maybe it was just one moment of frustration, but in the Bournemouth game, there was one moment where I think Spence lays it back to Vicario. Maybe he could have done it quicker, Spence's pass, but Vicario ends up hoofing out into the stand. Spence and Van de Ven both started arguing or basically saying, what are you doing to Vicario. So I can sense that frustration. That's not just with the fans, it can be with his own players as well. And I do wonder long term, he's such a good character and such an influential character that Frank really likes. That's a big positive, and he's a good shot stopper when he's playing well. But if Spurs really want to get to where they want to be, you do wonder if he is the man going forward. But I agree with Tom. From what we've seen with Kinski, or more to the point, what we haven't seen of him, I think that's quite telling. I mean, I know Frank said he was going to go full strength against Aston Villa, so you presume Vicario was going to play. But there's almost been this kind of unwritten rule in English football in the last few years where full strength in the cups means the whole, means the outfield players, but the backup keeper will play, because generally that's what happens, particularly in the early rounds. And yet he didn't play in this game. I don't seem to get the sense that Frank really has the full, has much faith in Kinski. He hasn't really given opportunities. I mean, Vicario's been such a hot topic all season, and yet Kinski can't really get a game. That seems to be quite instructive overall. Just finally, the one player out of that list of youngsters that you mentioned that I am really excited about is Luka Vuskovic. He's not at the club at the moment. He's on loan at Hamburg. People were asking whether he might come back, but I don't know whether there was a break clause in his transfer. But for what I'm told, he's very happy at Hamburg. He's getting regular game time. He effectively doesn't want to come back this season because it's working for him. It's up to Spurs to sort of, in the summer, I suppose, provide a kind of career path for him where he can make it at Tottenham, because I know it's pre-season, so it's probably a lot to. It's easy to get excited about performances in pre-season, but from what little that I saw of him, I got really, I was really excited. He's now Croatian international, age 18. They spent 12.5 million on him when he was 16. That's a big investment not that long ago. He feels like the one that there is a really bright future for, but it's hard to see where he gets in the team, because those are the two positions, so the one position, centre back, where they've got their key players in Romero and Van der Ven.
Yeah, there are some talented players out on loan. Will Lancashire's been doing well for Oxford. Mikey Moore, after a very shaky start, now loving his time at Rangers as well. I just wonder
Mikey Moore
with
as well.
yeah,
I forgot him when I saw the ones I was excited about.
I just think with Kinski at some stage, maybe if we're starting to think that Vicario is not the long-term future, it's only fair to give Kinski a run, because we haven't seen enough of him. And yes, initially when he came in under duress last season, he played really well. Then there was a bit of fragility, but maybe over 10 games we could at least make a proper judgment before we either bin him or keep him on a full-time basis. Just one more on this whole Frank business, and I want to get onto the possibility of relegation. But a lot of people, I mean, I think the general nub from most is, okay, there's no point in panicking at this stage and getting rid of Frank. But if we lose the next two games, goodness me, we've got to do something. And the name that keeps cropping up between now and the end of the season, just to boost everybody's morale a little bit, have some hopefully exciting forward-looking performances, throw Harry Redknapp back into the mix. He'll put an arm around everybody's shoulder. There'll be a bit of a bounce, I think, in the footsteps of most Spurs fans going to the first game that he's in charge of at the Lane. I mean, it's just madness. He's been out of the game for a little while now, but he's Harry after all. Would he be a sensible option if the worst happens against West Ham and Burnley over the next few days? Tom, eh?
I don't think so. Sorry. I think it's a...
You spoil sport.
I think it's a bygone era. I think Harry, I mean, what a job. I always think that, I'm definitely on the kind of end of the spectrum where I thought Redknapp did a brilliant job. I know some Spurs fans disagree on that a little bit, but, he was a fantastic manager for Tottenham. But I just think the game has, in inverted commas, moved on, And I think even Redknapp, you listen to his takes, and he's often on TalkSport, and, he's still a fascinating character to listen to. And, I've read most of his many books, and they're all really good reading. But I don't think I think he would admit, he's not sort of massively up to date anymore in terms of, who's playing and who isn't playing and who's good and who's not. It would be a real... And I mean, what would you think about the leadership as well, to be honest, Marcus? Like, I mean, they just hired a new sporting director, a new chief executive. They've got new owners. Imagine if their first big decision was to go back, 2008. So to go back 18 years to the manager 18 years ago. If that was their first big decision in managing the club, I think we would all have some serious...
they need a footballing man there, even if he's not the manager. They need somebody with proper football credentials to guide them through this choppy period. And it won't cost the club a penny, Tom B, because he's already said he'll do it for free. So there's nothing to lose there, is there?
Marcus, is he going to sign Chimbonda, Robbie Keane, Jermaine Defoe, Wilson Palacios?
Probably.
Who else did we miss from that list? From that moment?
As long as he doesn't go to Ricardo Rocha or Gilberto.
Yeah, that was before him, to be fair. I mean, Harry was at the Bournemouth game. We've said a few times he was watching the match at his beloved Bournemouth. To be fair, obviously, I presume he still lives locally because he has done for a long time around there. I mean, he's 78 now. I mean, look, he had an amazing managerial career, and he's one of those. He's one of those characters that people warm to, and he elevates performance, or he elevated performances back in the day. But just reflecting on his career, I mean, talk about that game. That's the game we talked about earlier, the one that I attended when Newcastle got battered 5-0. At that point, the Redknapp for England train was fully on. Was in full throttle, if that's the right phrase, steaming ahead, and very quickly after that, he was gone from Spurs. And then you look at his career since then. He had a 3 years actually at QPR. I can't remember it being that long. Then a bit. He managed Jordan, the country Jordan, 2016, and then a bit about Birmingham City when it was all a bit of a nightmare period for that club. It's been a long time since he's been right at the top, and that was at Spurs. So I guess from your perspective, he'd be the ultimate sort of vibes manager along with Glenn Hoddle, maybe. But
I just think a 3-month burst, and as Tom A said at the start of this podcast, it's not all about data. Sometimes it's just about putting your arm around the player, just giving them a little bit of belief. And I think that for a short period of time, Redknapp would be the man to do that. But I hope we don't get that far. I hope we win our next couple of league games and we don't have to worry. Now, listen, on the possibility of relegation, guys, Blue
I said that
Mountain
Mark
Wanderer
looked like he was an analyst, in his blue top at the start of the pod. I now retract all that comment. Yeah,
I'm all about
Marcus
heart,
like
not head.
the job in me. Yeah.
There's a lot in that, though.
My passive data analyst.
Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm picking Lambert and Butler against West Ham. Blue Mountain Wanderers says, guys, is relegation a possibility? Antonio Sinessa 7658 thinks we are in grave danger of going down. And Grey Hammery 7031 says, if we get beaten by West Ham, relegation most certainly is a big possibility. Well, at the moment, Tom B, Spurs are 14th, 27 points, so 13 points clear of West Ham. Obviously, that would come down to 10 if the Hammers win at the weekend. So the point you made a bit earlier, we're much nearer to the top 5 than we are to the bottom 3. But is there still a bit of a danger, especially if we do stumble in the next 2 games with a very ferocious fixture list to come thereafter, that we could be dragged into a relegation scrap?
God, it feels like Groundhog Day. I remember asking Ange about the possibility of relegation, which was not a question he enjoyed at all. And that was an 8-point gap at that point. It was more just the direction of travel was bad. The points they were picking up was bad, and it felt like it was a minor possibility they could be dragged into it. I just think looking at, let's just be clinical about it. 13-point gap to West Ham, even if they lose, that's still going to be 10. And in the last 2 seasons, I was surprised to realise this. I only noticed this when George Sessions brought it up after the Sunderland game, when he was asking Regis Lebris, if that's how you pronounce it right, the manager of Sunderland, about making 30 points and whether he basically thought Sunderland was safe then, because obviously we've got the magical 40-point cliche, but in the last 2 seasons, 30 points I think would have actually kept you up. That's how badly the relegated teams have done in the last couple of seasons, and obviously Spurs survived comfortably with 39 last year, and I don't think it's going to be too dissimilar this season. As much as Wolves are having a little revival, can't really see them getting out of it, and the teams West Ham, Burnley, even if West Ham beat Tottenham, I still think they're going to really struggle to get up to probably even sort of 30-35 points. So just purely on the numbers, Spurs have already got 27 in the bag. Can't see it, and it's not like the performance has been. I was going to say it's not like the performances have been dreadful. It's not some. I know from an entertainment perspective, maybe they have been, but it's not like they haven't been competitive. That's the difference. They've still got one of the best. I don't know if they're still top of the away record, top of the league for away points this season, but they're not. If they're not, they're right near it. So there's lots of reasons to think that Thomas Frank, whatever happens for his long-term future, if they stick with him, will get more than enough points not to get dragged into a relegation battle.
Marcus, West Ham are just looking up here, 13 points behind. West Ham have picked up 13 points in the last 2.5 months. So I think, these points gaps at the bottom, it takes a long time for them to be closed, and that's the thing, isn't it? 5 points to the top or 10 points to the top is nothing, because you can win those teams can win 2 or 3 in the bounce. At the bottom, teams move at a snail's pace. So, I mean, it's a decent gap.
I think it's probably just as well for us, though, that West Ham failed to beat Nottingham Forest the other night, and it did look as though they would for a while, because had they won that game and then beat us at the weekend, suddenly there'd only be a 7-point gap. But yeah, I agree with you. I don't think relegation is a concern. Famous last words. Now, guys, going to ask you in a moment, Tom, about injuries. But in terms of the running of the club, I did tweet a couple of days ago, very, very reliable source telling me that there's a lot of, concern amongst many as to how the club is being run. Very good business people. I mean, we've said this so many times, but a lack of understanding when it comes to actual footballing issues. Recco got in touch, asks, are we just helpless onlookers, staring through a one-way mirror into a club being managed existentially badly, with our disapproving rage ignored as we turn upon ourselves, forever guessing what the hell those in power are doing? And Stephen Smith, 4240, talks about Christian Romero, and this is the point that Tom B referred to just a few moments ago. Now, he supports the comments that Romero made, and you may recall that he essentially said that we need to be hearing from other people, not from me right now, but these people, the people that run the club, only pop out when things are going well and tell a few lies. Stephen says he's spot on with his judgment, but the point you made at the time, can the captain really be saying that publicly? And does it suggest that Thomas Frank does not have sufficient control of his players, and there's a huge disconnect from top to bottom? What would you say to that, Mr. Allnutt?
I mean, I still think that there's a lack of football brains, in the kind of executive positions at Tottenham. And we talked about this in the pod around Daniel Levy's departure, about how many really talented executives, have been at Spurs in the last kind of 20 years. And now they're in various other clubs doing really good jobs, in the Premier League. And I think, for all the talk about Vinay, who I think is, Frank spoke glowingly about him the other day, and you hear really good things about his, communication skills, about how he works with different departments, how he's giving people a little bit more space, for example, than Daniel Levy used to. I still think it kind of gets overlooked that at Arsenal, for example, where he was chief executive and he did give, Arteta time, but at Arsenal, his brief was very much commercial. It was very much financial. It was not really in terms of the football there. They had Richard Garlick there. Before that, they had Sam Leahy. They had they had Edu, of course, was kind of part of that triangle. It wasn't really on Vinay to kind of make the big football decisions. And it slightly sort of puzzles me in a way that there's this line that, comes from the kind of the owners at the moment, where there's all the big football decisions kind of belong to Vinay, that he's in charge of the day-to-day football operations at the club. Now, maybe Vinay, has a fantastic football brain that we're not aware of, and that maybe he's going to prove himself to be like that. But it does seem to me that on the basis of experience and evidence and what we know in terms of his past, that's not really what he has done before. And then obviously, you've got the two co-sporting directors, and you've got Paratici, who, clearly is the guy in charge of signings. And yet, the biggest signing Tottenham are going to have to make, seemingly, is to replace their sporting director, right? I mean, that is obviously not an ideal situation. And Langer, whose, preference, let's be honest, and perhaps his talent is more in terms of kind of the youth market, the academy, insights, all the things that Vinay told us were really going to be his brief this season, in contrast to what Fabio's remit is. So I personally think Tottenham, if Paratici is about to leave, I think they've got a really big decision to make in this sporting director appointment, assuming they're going to replace Paratici. That has to be a really key appointment. If we sort of fast forward 5 years and Tottenham are challenging at the top of the table in first or second, we'll look back, I think, and say that was a real nailed-on appointment. That was the one they got absolutely right. When Paratici left, that was the end of that era, and they got that one absolutely spot on. And whoever it's going to be has to have a real good football head. It has to be someone who can navigate the market, but also dictate, in terms of the football at Spurs, much more than is currently the case. Now, clearly, there's also Rafael Mawson, who's on his way, from City. And I think he is going to, what people say about him is that he is very good in terms of negotiations. His big brief at City was in dealing with players and player contracts and that kind of thing. So we wait to see kind of what his role might be. And maybe he is that guy. But I do think there is still a lag at Spurs in terms of football executives, people who really know what they're doing in terms of football and are savvy in terms of football. And I still think Frank is probably having to deal with that upheaval as we speak.
I think just in addition to that, it's not just Tom there or us saying that I do think from various football agents across football that I've tried to be in contact with, throughout, that there's a similar feeling there, that the sort of questioning the leadership at the moment at Spurs, and a bit like Frank with the questions against him as being the manager of Tottenham, it's up to him to live up to those expectations and defy the doubters, I suppose. But at the moment, there does seem to be a bit of a question over the leadership right now. And you got to say the Paratici situation. If he's leaving for personal reasons, as has been mentioned, then I guess it's difficult to know what to do about that. I mean, people move on from jobs all the time, unforeseen circumstances. But it's been a bit of a disastrous situation, hasn't it? Really, given what they went through to rehire him, to hire him in October officially, and do the video questions already about how's it going to work with co-sporting directors, and for him to be gone probably by the end of this window to go to Fiorentina. I think everyone's expecting that now. It's pretty disastrous, and it's just yet more upheaval. I mean, Thomas himself has spoken about the number of executives, as Tom puts it, to have left the club is at an all-time high in 1 year for Tottenham's whole history. So you're going to expect a bit of turbulence, I suppose, in fairness to him and the club. It's on them to settle that down over this window in particular in the coming months, and for the Lewis family to really back up some of the messaging that had been coming out after they ousted Daniel Levy and talked about this new era coming. Now, Conor Gallagher coming in for relative big money. I mean, Tom's explained it's a good deal, but £35 million is not nothing. But as you've already explained, Marcus, that's effectively the fee they got for Brennan Johnson. So let's see what happens for the rest of the window. But until they've answered those questions through action, and therefore hopefully improve performances on the pitch, I think those questions surrounding the ownership and the leadership will remain.
Yeah, and it has to be said that the silence at the top of the club of late has been deafening after the great PR following the departure of Daniel Levy. We were hearing nothing. Maybe it's reasonable to keep quiet until the end of the January transfer window, but then I really think we need to get an update from those in charge as to what the plan is. And we'll throw out this offer right now to the club. We would love to have Vinay or a member of the Lewis family to come and join us on the Tottenham Way podcast, and we'll have a very pleasant chat. And let's tell everybody it's all about the fans, really. That's what Bill Nicholson and all the greats said back in the day. The club is nothing without the supporters. Keep them informed, and then you will inevitably have a much better relationship with them. We just want to understand the philosophy. Excuse me. Getting emotional after all that. One more issue just to touch upon. This is primarily a question for Tom A, because I think you mentioned it a little while ago and suggested you might have a source who could help. But suddenly injuries are piling up. I did see quite a funny tweet yesterday saying, how dare Ange Postecoglou leave the club in the summer and yet continue to injure all our players? Now, I can't find the name of the person who posed this particular question, but it was this: why are there so many soft tissue problems once again? Is it the fault of the manager or the medical staff? And he went on to list Davis, Tell, Romero, Gray, Udogi twice, Takai, Kudus, Bergvall twice, Bentancur and Richarlison. What's going on there, Mr. Allnutt?
Yeah, it's another bad crisis, isn't it, for Tottenham? I mean, I have to say it's not as bad as it was last season. I know it probably, it feels very reminiscent of what happened last year. It's exactly the same time of year as well. Clearly, the January transfer window when Tottenham were desperate last season, like they sort of are now as well. It all does feel very familiar. I hear that completely, but I think the severity under Ange is still, something beyond what we're seeing under Frank. For example, this time last year in January, Ange had 12 players out, and they were all injured, by the way. They were all out injured, as opposed to, at the moment, Frank has 6 injuries and 2, away on international duty. So it's, we're talking about double the amount this time last year that Ange, depending on which side of the kind of Ange debate you sit, either Ange had to put up with or Ange was responsible for. I don't really mind, insert Ange stance here. But that was the case. A year ago it was 12 players, now it's only 6. The other thing as well with Ange, of course, was that there were recurrences. That it was Richarlison who kind of had a calf, I think, then came back and was almost immediately had a hamstring. Odegaard had hamstring and then came back and had a hamstring again. Clearly, the everyone will remember are Van der Ven and Romero, who came back in the Chelsea game, I think, and both broke down in that same game again with hamstring injuries. So it was the idea that not only were players pulling up, but there was a disconnect between the medical department and the coaching department about when they should return. And that was a really crucial aspect of that injury crisis, and that was also a part of the reason why it was so prolonged under Ange. That. I remember there was a stat I think that I wrote, which was that he never had fewer than 5 players out between November and basically the end of last season, and so it wasn't just kind of the peak of the crisis, which was obviously, incredibly bad in terms of the 12 players out, but it was also just the consistency of it, and to be fair to Frank, or, less of an excuse for Frank, he actually has had, most of his kind of best team-ish available, through most of the season. It's only been in the last few weeks that he's been really hit hard. And then obviously Ange as well, he had the history, didn't he? It was that thing where he had injury problems before at Yokohama, at Celtic, and at Brisbane Roar, I think, from memory. And that his stance was always, he told the medical staff that, I've seen this before, the players gradually will evolve and harden up and get used to my methods, and then it will work out eventually. And of course it didn't really, it just got worse, and that was part of the problem. I think, to be honest, where the two examples kind of are similar is, I think in both cases, I think the squad isn't big enough. I think that is a big part of it. You get to that place where they are at the moment, in a way, or they're just sort of starting to touch on it a little bit, where you're sort of overplaying players because you have a lack of options. And it's that snowball effect that we found under Ange for so long, which is that, when you overplay someone, the next guy gets injured and the next guy gets injured. And it's not impossible, for example, that Palhinha, who really is playing a lot at the moment, Gray, who is being played a lot, and has had a, relatively recent muscle injury. Look at Richarlison, suddenly had to play every week all the time and then, breaks down with a hamstring. It is that thing where
Bentancur as well, of course.
Bentancur, of course. Yeah, exactly. So you look at the best squads, they have to have options to prevent injury, not just to react to them. And I think that's been a problem under Ange, just as it is now under Frank.
Well, hopefully he'll find fit 11 players for the weekend. We better finish by touching upon this game against West Ham, who, unlike us, are still in the FA Cup after beating Queen's Park Rangers. We think we have trouble. Queen's Park Rangers have now gone out in the third round of the FA Cup for a record 54th time. I mean, that's just horrendous. But, every week we get to this stage, Tom, home game, lower league opposition. Well, this will be no problem at all, will it? This will be no problem at all, Tom, will it?
Definitely don't say that with Tottenham ever, particularly at home at the moment. But having said that, if Spurs are in a bit of a pickle at the moment, then it's not as big a crisis as West Ham, who look very much like they're heading for the drop. I've been slightly surprised that Nuno Espirito Santo hasn't been able to have as much of an effect as I thought he might do at West Ham. I know it didn't work out for him at Tottenham, and that kind of comes back to the conversation we had earlier about managers who making that step up to a club like Spurs. It doesn't work for everyone, but with the job he did at Forest, I really thought he would have more of an impact. But it seems like the quality of the squad has just gone down and down over recent years, to the point where the defence just has been a real problem for them this season. Midfield as well, all over the pitch. I mean, they had Callum Wilson in a couple of games, and now his contract's been ripped up. They've signed more strikers this window, but they're players that come from outside the Premier League, and not just outside the Premier League, but I think from Brazil, if I'm right, or maybe it's Portugal. But that's going to take an adaptation period. I don't think there'd be many people expecting them to produce fireworks straight away. Maybe if they can pull it off, then that would be great from West Ham's point of view. But the history of the recruitment at West Ham in recent years would make you be sceptical of that. They've obviously had the Lucas Paqueta situation, which has been really unfortunate. And even Jared Bowen, who's been Mr. Reliable, Mr. Consistent, what a wonderful player he is, fantastic pro, is struggling to produce the same kind of numbers that he has in recent years. I don't watch West Ham enough, so I can't really claim to know exactly why, but I presume it isn't just down to him. It's probably the way the team is playing. So this feels like the perfect fixture for Spurs, really, if there is one. But it's West Ham. I mean, I'm not a Spurs fan, but even I am very aware of the numerous sort of mad games that Spurs have had against West Ham. And what was the one where it was 3-3, where there was Spurs 3-0 up, and there was the last minute wonder goal from,
Mourinho was in charge.
yeah.
Gareth Bale was playing. It was all going so well.
Yeah, exactly. So there'll be no, even regardless of the Thomas Frank sort of situation and how it's been going at home, there will be certainly no Spurs fans who are going to be counting any chickens going to West Ham. But they really, really should be winning this. That's for sure, based on the quality of the two sides this season.
Yeah, I'll be there in my season ticket. Actually, Tom A, I don't want to ask you because every time Spurs have a winnable game, I come to you and you go, yeah, I think this is one they're definitely going to win. And every single time we don't. So either don't answer or just give us a different answer, please. Which will it be?
Yeah, they're definitely going to win.
Oh,
they're playing
no.
at home against West Ham,
That's it.
Easy win, 3 or 4-0, I reckon. No, I mean, listen, I expect them to win. I'm not going to lie. Like, if they don't beat West Ham, then they and Frank will be in all sorts of trouble, I think. But it'll be interesting to see if they start Gallagher. I wonder what will happen there because we sort of say that Gallagher Premier League proven, ready to go, but he's only started one game in the last. Since early December, he started the Spanish Super Cup semi against Real Madrid last week, which is obviously a big game, and that suggests that Simeone thinks he's match fit and everything. But he hasn't been playing that regularly. I mean, he's been playing regular games, but not many starts. So, it'd be interesting to see if he kind of gets thrown straight in, or maybe more likely kind of comes on for the last sort of half an hour, perhaps. But another opportunity, another chance to turn the corner, isn't it?
Yet another one. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank everybody who's come up with those comments, thousands of others that we couldn't get to, but we do appreciate them. So many ways, as we always say, for you to get in touch with us. You can email us, tottenhamwaypod@gmail.com. We're on Insta, we're on Facebook, we're on TikTok, we're on YouTube, where we love to get a like and a subscribe. It makes a big difference. There's probably a whole host of other ways you can get in touch with us that I've forgotten about. And anything at all that you want to say, we take the positives, we kind of take the negatives as well. And we hope there'll be more positives to reflect upon after the game at the weekend. Tom, anything else you wish to say? No? Tom
no,
B
please do subscribe.
Head.
Please press like and subscribe buttons if you're watching on YouTube, and really helps us out, helps us keep going. So yeah, and as Marcus said, leave comments, send us emails, and thanks for all your support.
And we will be back with a reaction podcast after the West Ham game. So until then, from Tom Barclay of the Sun, from Tom Allnutt of the Times, and from me, Marcus Buckland, it's the same old message. Come on, you Spurs.